Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Thoughtful Bro, live streaming today on A Mighty Blaze. Little bit different today. We are live streaming on Zoom instead of on StreamYard as usual. So that was the cause for a little bit of a delay, but do not worry, for today's show is going to be one, as they say, for the ages. A little bit of introduction before we get to our wonderful guest today, Karen Armstrong. As you know, we are here on The Thoughtful Bro every Tuesday at 2 for what makes great books tick and what makes great authors tick. Almighty Blaze, where we stream, is an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers virtually during COVID and beyond. And at Almighty Blaze, we are never, ever asking for your money. If you want to support us, you can do so by liking us on social media or following us or going to almightyblaze.com and subscribing to our newsletter. All of this is completely free and driven by passionate volunteers who love books like myself. But in the case that you are ready and willing to spend money on books, you can do it by buying books by one of the great spiritual and religious historians of our time, books that provide a unique and stirring and rigorously researched insights into our relationship with the world. Books that tell us that recycling, technology, and political protests just are not enough, and to save our fragile planet, we need nothing less than a spiritual rebirth. Books like Sacred Nature by Karen Armstrong. Regarding questions, if you have questions for Karen, please post them in the comments and we will ask. And now on to our guest. Karen Armstrong is a religious historian whose books have been translated into 45 languages. Her works include the international bestseller, A History of God, as well as Islam, A Short History, and A Short History of Myth. The New York Times called her recent book, The Lost Art of Scripture, quote, a dazzling accomplishment, a reflection of an encyclopedic knowledge of comparative religion and of a wisdom about spirituality in the human species. I feel that description, frankly, could apply to all of Karen's works. Karen was appointed by Kofi Annan to the high-level group of the UN Alliance of Civilizations to study the causes of religious extremism. She was subsequently awarded the Franklin D. Roosevelt Four Freedoms Medal. And among countless other distinctions, she is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. As I said, her most recent book is Sacred Nature. And in a review of Sacred Nature, The Guardian wrote, quote, much has been written on the scientific and technological aspects of climate change, but Armstrong's book is both more personal and more profound. Its urgent message is that hearts and minds need to change if we are to once more learn to revere our beautiful and fragile planet. Karen Armstrong is, for me, possibly the author that I have read most and loved most and read longest of any other living author. I think that she is a treasure to the global literary community, and it is quite an honor to have her on the show today. Karen, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. So Karen, I found enormous inspiration in this work. As always, I found, our tastes almost completely overlap in terms of our love for spiritual poetry and ancient poetry and so on. And I think the argument at the core of this book is something that, in full transparency, I completely agree with. You are no doubt preaching to the choir when I read this book. But I want to spend this interview talking not only about what the book is about, but I want to spend a little time in the interview as well, talking about some arguments that could be made against this book and some of your points of view. And I think it would be just really fruitful to kind of hear how you think about this issue, which is so complex and so thorny. So that's sort of the setup for the interview, but maybe the best way to start would just be for you in your own words to describe what is Sacred Nature about?
Well, it's not enough for us to listen to the science sometimes. We hear rather frightening news about the way we are heading for disaster, and that tends to freeze us somehow. We don't know what we can do. But what we have to do is change not only the way we behave, but also the way we think about nature, because over the centuries, since about the 16th century, we in the West have been dissociating ourselves from nature, seeing it as a resource. And we've done great things with that, with our medicine and our science. But we've also done bad things, as we know, and we are heading for a catastrophe. But that means we have to change the way we think about the world, and we can't just do that in a hurry. And so what I was trying to do, I originally started out to write about this book with one of my great long books. And my publisher said, no, do something short now and tell people what to do. Because so it's a sort of how to book where I look at, we do about 10 chapters where we see how we change our attitudes, not just our behavior, but our attitudes to nature, and start to realize what generations and generations of people in all cultures, China, India, as well as Europe, how they associated themselves with nature, how they revered it, what were their practices, how did they change, how did they think about nature, how did they relate to it. And so I've tried to do that in a short book with giving at the end of each chapter something that people can do to change the way they think about nature and therefore the way we behave.
Indeed, I might cynically say that the advice to keep it short and give practical advice is just how you hit the American audience. Like that is what we Yankees love, is something short with lots of practical advice. So thank you for that. And I think it certainly gives the book more of a chance to reach the audience it deserves. Karen, I think one way to set up the central argument of the book is on a premise that you have that there are two sides to human nature, which can be described as logos and mythos, a more rational side in logos and a more spiritual side in mythos. But rather than have me describe it, could you just describe those two sides of human nature? Because I think that will set up some subsequent questions that I have.
Well, we need both of them. We need a logos, which is with reason and science, with our medicine, with our thinking, with our politics, with our knowledge of history and our knowledge of one another. We need facts, and that is crucially important. And we're getting a lot of factual information about the damage we're doing to nature. And that tends to freeze us somehow because, well, what can we do about this? So mythos, this is something that a myth we need to define. A myth can be described, we all know about myths, various stories and that people have told throughout the ages in all the cultures to help people spiritually. But a myth is something that in one sense happened once, but which also happens all the time. A myth is not just telling us about something in the distant past. It is telling us something about the way we humans live in the world, the difficulties we encounter, the insights we have, and how. And it has to be put into practice. It's no good just having a nice feeling, touchy-feely relationship to nature. We've got to act, and myth always gives us. You don't get a myth properly until you've translated it into practical action, and that's what I've tried to do with the book, to reintroduce us to nature in a way, in a mythical way, drawing on the wisdom of the great world religions from time immemorial, the way they regarded nature as something sacred, not something that you took for granted, not something that in the Christian scriptures, in our Judeo-Christian scriptures, we're told very much to sort of take the earth and subdue it. At the end of the first chapter of Genesis, that's the command that God gives to Adam. And unfortunately, that's what we've done. We have taken the earth, we have subdued it, and it's become very dangerous. Other faiths in India or in China, for example, they tell us to revere nature. They see not nature as just a scientific thing, a physical thing, but one that's imbued with spirituality. They don't see a God that is stuck up in the heavens looking down benignly from us from afar. They see a force, a sacred force. In India, they call it Rita or Brahman. In China, they call it Qi. which is a force that is unspeakable, ineffable, indescribable, because it's both physical and spiritual. And it is a force that is continuously at work in the world, bringing things into being, bringing the nature into growth all the time. The Chinese, particularly in the Taoist religion, they watch the way our nature burgeons, and then how it retreats into the earth during the winter and goes to sleep and then comes to life again. And we're taught to revere this, to act upon it in poetry, song, and music, but also to change certain ways of behaving. If you are revering nature, you can't just treat it as simply as a resource, something that we are completely damaging day by day. So, there are 10 various steps, like the golden rule or kenosis, an emptying of self. So often we put ourselves first and our own needs first, but we have also to empty ourselves sometimes of our desires and our needs, and just put them to one side in order that other people and other creatures and nature itself can thrive. So, yes.
Yeah, but Karen, so I'm so sympathetic to this, and I think, I read once in the New York Times recently, you did an interview with the New York Times, and they said, who would you like to have to dinner if you could have anybody? And you said, I think it was Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, and Confucius. And I thought to myself, those are maybe the exact 4 people I would also invite to a dinner. I mean, so I love the mythic way of thinking. I think it's natural, profound. It is extraordinarily healthy for your emotional well-being to think of oneself in a mythic way. But I think you probably couldn't deny, Karen, that we live in an age when this mythic point of view about life is in a state of degradation, one might say. I mean, I think your fellow countryman, Richard Dawkins, is somebody who I also enormously respect and whose books I've read a great deal of. But I can only imagine, if you bring, some ideas to Richard Dawkins about myths and so on, like what he would do and how he would just decimate that point of view. And I think, frankly, we live in a time where who are the real culture heroes, say, in America? These are people like Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. You can't go into the job market today as a young person and say, like, well, what I'm really interested in is myth. Rather, I mean, what people want to hear about is somebody who's interested in mathematics and engineering and so on. And I guess just the question to put to you is, how does one even make the case in this age of logos that myth is important without just being immediately sort of argued down?
Well, basically, we've got to change the way we think, whether we like it or not. Logos has done wonderful things for us. I mean, I myself have benefited enormously from modern medicine, for example. And I'm able to speak to you today because of excellent practice that I've had. But we also need to think differently about the world, about nature, instead of, I mean, people don't even seem to look at it much anymore. How often have you gone to a beautiful place, and what people are doing, either talking on their phones, exactly, or taking photographs, one after the other, instead of sitting in front of a beautiful mountain, click, 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 they take about 20 photographs. And do they ever look at them again, I wonder, because, but they prefer a virtual reality of it instead of being there in presence in nature itself. We are retreating from nature in a way that is dangerous, so basically we just change the way we think. Just for example, and these are not great, huge ways, things that I'm laying down. I'm just suggesting at the end of one chapter that for 10 minutes a day, we put our phones to one side, just turn them off. It's painful, but turn it off, and just sit in your garden, or just looking out of the window, or at the sea, or at a beautiful place, and just look, listen, watch the little insects crawling around, listen to the the birds. Look at the leaves, the way they're falling, and the way and now in the autumn, and this the life that is going on. I've got a tree, can't see it now, it's in pitch darkness out there, but it's a huge tree, some couple of streets down, that is beginning to shed its leaves. And I watch that tree quite a lot. I look up from my desk over there and I watch that tree, the life that's in it, the way that tree has an extraordinary life of its own. We're not anthropomorphizing it, we're not giving it human characteristics, but we see how it changes day by day, how the colors change, how the creatures that come into it, squirrels and birds flocking in the whole time. That tree has a life of its own that we need to become aware of. So if we just sit for just start off with 10 minutes a day, phones off, just reacquainting ourselves with nature, that's a start. Just to reconnect again, because we are dangerously retreating from it in ways and to learn to look at it not just as a resource, but as something on which we're absolutely dependent. We talk about holiness and the feelings we have towards, say, God. But one of those feelings we should be having is a state of absolute dependence. We depend on nature for every breath we breathe. For everything that. The fact that that night comes, for example, and we can rely, we take it so much for granted. This extraordinary rhythms that happen, but which are now beginning to be very, very disturbed.
Right.
Because of it. So just to become aware of it, that's step one. 10 minutes a day, off with the phones. Sit in your garden or in a park, or even just look out of your window. And just put yourself in the presence of nature, and poetry can help us too. I think. I mean, right. I've been a great fan of Wordsworth, and in his poem Tintern Abbey, he tells us he's learned to look at nature differently. Something that we've got to do: change the way we think about nature, change our approach to it, and learn to look at it differently. And he said, and what he discovers was it's extraordinarily similar to what the Chinese have always said about nature, what the Indians have always said about nature, what the Kabbalah sees about nature. I've learned to look on nature, not as he says, as I did when I was a young man, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity. And our sad behavior is making us feel this, our association with nature today, what we're doing to it, what we're wrecking it. But hearing oftentimes, he's learned to look at it differently. He's not nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. And notice there, he won't call that God, because we've got a very different idea of God in the West, a God up in the heavens. But this is so similar to what the Chinese call Rita or Chi or Brahman, that this force, a sense sublime of something deeply interfused, that's in the light, the setting sun, that's the living air, the blue sky, and in our own minds too, to reacquaint ourselves with nature in that way. Instead, and just taking off those earphones, taking and just letting the sights and sounds of nature become one with us again, because we are very, very remote from it these days.
I agree. And, a phrase that was coming back to me as I was reading this book was, there's a phrase by the American intellectual Audre Lorde, and she says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And the reason why I kept thinking about that was, there's a way that the language of science cannot actually fight back against this scientific age that we're in. Like, and I think I've heard you say this in interviews, like if you talk about emissions, or you talk about, degrees Fahrenheit that the sea temperature will rise and so on, that mode of thinking it's not that there's not merit there, but it will ultimately just be overwhelmed by all the ways that the scientific point of view is beneficial and dominant and full of profit and so on. But what I hear when you're talking now about all this poetry is the need to build upon the foundation of beauty and communion with nature, and build upon, frankly, lessons that we've learned from, say, Confucius, who was the first one to speak about the golden rule and expand the golden rule to include not just humans, but nature as well. And what I'm talking about is just using these foundations of spirituality and art and compassion to build up a kind of counter narrative about the world.
Yes, it's to change our mindsets towards nature, to make ourselves aware of it. And we can do it. It's no good saying, right, I'm going to look at nature now properly from this day forward, because because we've got to change our habits a bit. So that's why I've done it step by step, giving us a little thing to do, one thing at a time. And sitting in the garden, for example, just 10 minutes a day, just for kickoff. But also, you hear the still sad music of humanity. Wordsworth saw the sorrow of human behavior, but for us now, I think we have to frighten ourselves a little bit and make ourselves aware of what we're doing. But you're right about the golden rule. I mean, the Chinese saw this. Confucius was the first to enunciate the golden rule. Do not impose on others, he said, what you yourself do not desire. And that is the basis of spirituality and of morality and of decency. But 200 years later, the Confucian Mencius said, yeah, that's fine, but we also have to apply it to nature as well, to the natural world, as well as to our own. And in the 10th or 11th century, as I describe in the book, the Neo-Confucians built up a whole new spirituality based on the golden rule, listening to nature, listening to its sounds, and really communing with it in ways that we can all do ourselves. We can all do these things by ourselves. One of them used to say, began to feel such an affinity with nature that he didn't like to cut the grass that grew underneath his window, because he said the feelings I have for the grass and myself are the same. And another one said when he heard a donkey cry, he could hear the crying of the whole of humanity. We need to just alert ourselves to take, just as we want to treat all other human beings as we would wish to be treated ourselves. That's the basis of morality and the basis of civilization, basically. But we now have to treat that to nature too, and see that because they are our companions, these people, these forces, we depend on them, and we don't often think about that every breath we breathe is life-giving and essential to us. And we just forget all these things to make ourselves aware of that. Listen to the if you're not the cry of a donkey, but to the birds trying to cheep against all the traffic that that is happening, and the squirrels, even in the middle of London, right here, the squirrels running up and down our trees. Nature is there, and we have somehow to connect with it again.
And you make so many wonderful points in the book about how humans by nature are not totally anthropocentric, and we're not built to have compassion merely for other humans. And those are some of the examples that you just gave. The way that we naturally have compassion for animals and even trees and plants and so on. These are natural feelings within humans. Before I get on to just a few ways, I want to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit and kind of say the other side and hear how you respond to that. But one concept before we get there that I wanted to bring up was this concept of ecstasis. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that is a theme, or not a theme, but a kind of a concept that comes up in a lot of your work and certainly in this book. And I just wanted you to explain that. And how does that connect to some of the ideas that you're putting forth?
Well, ecstasy, we tend to think of it as something rather dramatic. Like people have visions or wonderful sort of mental adventures. But ecstasy simply means stepping outside. Stas ex, outside, stas is standing. Standing outside ourselves just for a little while, because we are such self-centered creatures. We think about ourselves for morning, noon, and night, how we're feeling, what our emotions are. Just to put we're supposed, that's what the golden rule is supposed to do. That you have to look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. That is the golden rule and the essence of all spiritual, and it's the basis of civilization too. But now we've got, as the Chinese pointed out, do that with nature too. Start looking at nature as something that we damage, just as we damage other people with a thoughtless world. And Coleridge does that beautifully in the poem I discuss at the very end of the book with the Ancient Mariner. That I used to hate that poem when I was at school. We seemed to learn it. It seems to go on and on forever, and I didn't. But now I see he was dead right, because it's about, as you know, this sailor who during a voyage shoots a bird, an albatross, which has been very friendly to the crew, and then nature takes its revenge. But how often? And when he describes what happens, he suddenly goes pale and with horror with what he'd done, and he says, "With my crossbow, I shot the albatross for no reason at all." He's got there's no rhyme or reason. He just did it. But how many times do we damage nature without thinking? Day by day, we don't even give it a thought, just as we damage other people often without giving it a thought. And the mariner has to come to terms with this, to suddenly see that nature is full of beauty, and it's the moment when he sees some fish in the sea, and he just thought of these things as slimy things before. And then he sees the beauty of them, the beauty and the fact they've got lives of their own, and that at that moment, he's forgiven, and the albatross, which is sprung, the dead bird strung around his neck, falls off into the sea, and he's liberated. Somehow, Coleridge was saying, somehow that's what we do. We damage without thinking the universe, nature, day by day, like just as that we shoot the albatross, and but we have to reacquaint ourselves so that we see even a fish or watch the moon as the mariner does, and suddenly sees the moon as something extraordinarily beautiful instead of just looking at it and taking it for granted. We need somehow to reacquaint ourselves with nature so that because we have in the ancient world, religion was all about nature, about seeing the divine not stuck up there in the heaven, but in every tree, in every leaf, in every flower, in every animal, in every plant. They learn to look at each of these things as sacred, as filled with beauty and life that is different from our own, but on which we depend day by day.
Yeah.
And somehow we've got to reacquaint ourselves with that little by little, because we just sort of see things through. We take a photograph of it rather than look at nature itself these days.
Right. I thought that the epilogue that unpacked the Rime of the Ancient Mariner was just astoundingly beautiful. It was very moving. I got choked up reading it. I'd never thought of that poem that way, and reading it in this context just brought that poem to life to me in just an astonishing way. I thought, what a way to finish that book. That was some remarkable writing. And so I want to just pivot for a moment into a part of the interview where we just talk about how difficult this issue is about us and the environment. So I have two questions about that. The first is something that you brought up before, saying that, well, we're talking on this computer now. I mean, you're in London, I'm in Boston, and our computers are filled with precious metals that had to be mined probably on some obscure location in the world. The electricity that powers all of this is fossil fuel produced, at least in part. So what do you say to one of the classic, not so much arguments, but reasons for apathy, which is that we are just basically complicit. The same way that what they always said about Al Gore. I mean, he's going around talking about an inconvenient truth on a jet, and so he's polluting in the moment that he's criticizing pollution. And what a luxurious point of view to have. What do you feel about that argument?
Well, I agree. I've spent a lot of time flying around the world talking about nature, and here I am. Every time we do that, we damage the universe. We damage the environment. We've got to become aware of this, and stop flying around so much. Because I noticed after the pandemic, what did people do? They're zooming down to fly off in aeroplanes, and I thought, no, you're not learning. We're not learning that. And every day, because I used to be such a frequent flyer, but I get a sort of little email on my phone from British Airways saying, we're longing to see you back, etc. Dream on, because we've got to stop doing a lot of this. I was, doing some lecturing on the book a little while ago, and I said, all this flying I'm doing. We've got to become aware of that. Just becoming aware, just as the point of you shoot an albatross and you don't give it a thought until you suddenly start seeing and feeling the consequences. Now now we're beginning to see the consequences, and we like to put it out of our minds because it seems so huge, what we're facing, and so frightening. And then we look, I mean, I'm old now. I probably won't see all this, but the young people today, what are we leaving them with? What are we leaving them to deal with? And somehow we have to make ourselves a bit uncomfortable, and just allow that niggle of awareness next time we're just flying out somewhere, or driving a car when we could easily take public transport, that kind of thing. Just starting to, little by little, build up a sense of consciousness for us and for the next generation.
So you mentioned in there the way that the problem feels so big and it's so scary because it's so big. And I just wanted to list just a few of the issues that create this sense of apathy. I mean, there's a lot of problems in human life, but climate change is a very particular kind of problem, which is very different from other major problems like, say, war or poverty or racism. And I just want to go through just a few of the reasons why, even as I think about it, I just feel often overwhelmed and I have a penchant towards apathy. And just to list a few. So first of all, it is not a direct human to human injustice. It's like nobody who does anything related to global warming is ever like rarely directly harming another human being, which is so different than, say, racism or war. These are deeply slow moving problems that are just hard to even notice because it's just happening so slowly over time. You can't kind of notice it with your own senses in a way in your own immediate life. These are hidden problems. The way that you eat beef for dinner. How was that cow killed? Where was that cow? Where did that cow live? The repercussions of our behavior are very hidden from us. Another issue with global warming is, as you said earlier, you've your own personal health has been benefited by the scientific life, that we lead. And I feel the exact same way. Some of my children would not have been born. It's possible both my wife and I would not be even alive if not for a number of medical procedures. And that's just one aspect of life. So global warming is not uniformly bad. It's obviously good. In fact, the good sort of is so much more immediate and easy to measure than the bad. And finally, I would just say that hundreds of millions of people make their living by a kind of extraction economy in one way or the other. And it's extraordinarily difficult to think of how you would put these people out of work if they were severely restrained from doing this kind of extractive work vis-a-vis nature. Anyway, I've gone on for a little while there, but what does that all add up to? It adds up to the problem is so huge, it makes me think just sometimes, it is bad, but until an absolute catastrophe that threatens immediately all life on Earth, it's too complicated to feel like you can do anything about. What is your response to that kind of sentiment?
Yeah, well, I think you put it beautifully, that this is so huge, and it invades the interstices of our daily life in all kinds of ways. But I think what we first need to do is just make ourselves a little bit uncomfortable with it all. And none of us like feeling uncomfortable, and so our minds we hasten to withdraw from it when these issues. But we should, and I think if this book is saying anything, it's just make yourself a little bit uncomfortable day by day. You're not going to start off by being some complete nature lover overnight. Just next time you see, I've never driven a car in my life because I have a form of epilepsy. But I often say, look, do you need to drive that car to that particular venue at that particular moment? Just starting to sow a little seed of discomfort, a little seed of discomfort that niggles slightly. I don't expect people to sort of start having visions of Wordsworthian visions of nature, or be struck dumb with horror at what we're doing, because that's. But just make ourselves a little bit uncomfortable, just as we should be uncomfortable about the inequity of our societies. The fact, here I am living in London, in a very nice area of London, and there are people up the road sleeping in doorways in the street. That's not right. And we pass these people by, and we should let that there's something wrong about this, something very, very wrong. And we should allow that little seed of discomfort to niggle at us. And the same applies to nature. And so these hints that I'm giving are not expecting us to become Wordsworthian figures day by day, or nature enthusiasts completely, just have that little niggle, or undertake this little practice that starts to create a new mindset. It's not going to be something like the road to Damascus, or some great vision, but we can learn from just the small little things that we can learn to do to make ourselves aware of this, just so that it is in our consciousness and not just pushed to the back of our minds because it's too big for us to handle.
Right.
Because we've got to start somewhere.
Right.
Because your children and their children, what are they going to think of us? Think of that. How they will curse us when they are faced with the hideous problems that we're beginning to sense now. And we see it in other parts of the world where they're already feeling the effects of climate change.
Sure.
And there are huge problems growing up. And we live in our nice, comfortable societies. It's easy to block it out. We need that little niggle to keep us alert to this. And it's no good having great gusts of emotion, because those come and go. But those little moments of disquiet that we should be trying to introduce into our lives are the source of a change.
Yes. And Karen, so beautifully said. I really agree with that. And it makes me think about other times in history. And I think you are the perfect person to ask this question to. We talked at the beginning about the difference between logos and mythos, and how the logos is dominant now, and we need a spiritual rebirth, for lack of a better term. And I was thinking, what are the other times in history that might be similar to this? And I think in the book you talk about the kind of context of some of the great spiritual leaders in human history, people like the context that Confucius came into, the context that Jesus came into, the context that Muhammad came into, and how they showed a different way to live and a different set of values. And are those appropriate comparisons? I guess another way to ask this question is, I'm looking for a reason to hope. I'm looking for a reason to think that humankind has the resources within itself to enact this kind of spiritual rebirth and to meet this moment with a great spiritual reinvigoration. And is it fair to say that we've been, in one way or another, faced with equal problems before, and the human race has shown itself capable of meeting the moment spiritually?
Yes, I think that I think we have we've got developed over the years a wrong sort of attitude about religion, I sometimes feel. It's a lot about believing, especially in the West, believing a whole lot of doctrines, or believing in God. Though, I mean, gracious me, when I think of the God that I was given as a child, the Catechism at the age of 8, what is God? God is the Supreme Spirit who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfections. Well, that left me cold. And I think a lot of people have been left cold by that, or else, the hymns and things seem to relate to something away and apart from us, and not in our day-to-day lives. That we need to see. I call it sacred nature. That nature is miraculous almost. The fact that the sun rises every morning was never taken for granted in the ancient world. In ancient Egypt, the priests would follow the journey of the sun as it rose every morning. And they imagined, made a great drama of it, of how it would rise. Because in Egypt, of course, you see the sun all day, and it rises to the height of the heavens, and then it sinks into darkness. And they imagine the sun dying every night, and how miraculous that every morning it's brought to life again. Those kind of myths won't suit us. But somehow we've got to become aware of the fact how marvelous it is that the sun does rise every day.
Mm.
Our solar system is, of course, the scientists can tell us about the marvels of the solar system and how it works, and how the trees, that famous tree of mine, how every year it comes back. We need to reignite a sense of wonder and not taking things for granted, just in small matters. And we need to completely rejig our idea of a distant God gazing down at us from afar, which was not at all what the Greek Orthodox had either. They maintained their own vision of Artemis, who had the goddess of nature, who was present in every single flower, in every single leaf, in every single tree, but unseen. And that they just brought that into Christianity. And they were very astonished when the Western Christians started to arrive in the Holy Land, and the Greek Orthodox priests would see them falling on their knees and weeping and crying and sobbing in the Holy Land. They said, what on earth's the matter with them? Don't they understand all land is holy?
Yeah.
Their land is just as holy as ours. And they had that. We lost that, I think, in the West. And of course, the West has become so powerful that we've taken our science with us, and it's done wonderful things. But this idea of a distant God, that instead of seeing the wonder every day, and every year the Egyptians saw the Nile, the flooding of the Nile, as an absolutely miraculous thing. They saw it as their whole lives depended, their economy depended upon it. But they didn't just say, oh, well, it's because of some scientific little niggle here. No, they saw how wonderful it was and how they depended upon it. Somehow
Karen,
we need to get that sense of dependence and look at, yes, go on.
Yeah, would you say that this is maybe too reductive, but would you say that the perfectly healthy human being is sort of one part reason, one part this kind of wonder? Or, I mean, it seems like it's so lopsided right now, but like, what is the right balance? Or is that question just too reductive to even be meaningful?
Not at all. It's essential that we have both, as I've said in many books before, both logos and mythos. We need logos as reason and science. And it's done wonderful things, as I say, in medicine and in so many ways it's helped. But also mythos, where we look at the wonder of things, to reacquaint ourselves with the wonder of nature that was deliberately cultivated in ancient times.
Right.
And which we push to one side, but because it is miraculous that the solar system is extraordinary, and that we should marvel at the fact that every year we see the leaves coming back on the tree, and sometimes be aware of nature being fierce too, right. when it frightens us, and say, no, watch it. We should take that as a message, not just sort of brushing it off. If nature is squawking back at us, maybe we've done something wrong, and maybe we won't see it as a divine thing, but necessarily but we should see it as something that nature is trying to speak to us sometimes in various frightening ways.
Yeah, and I think you do such a good job in the book of just explaining how the mentality in this age we live in is just nature is just another machine. And this goes back to Newton and Descartes. And nature is another, there is no wonder in it. It's just something to kind of dissect and manipulate. And God is standing in heaven, just the grand manipulator and kind of the grand engineer of it all. But I want to ask one more question, and then we'll have a few questions from the audience. But this is a sort of different kind of question, Karen, just taking a step back and looking at your career, because as I said, I'm such a fan of yours. I was looking through all your books. I think I've probably read 8 or 9 of your books, and several of them I've read many times. And looking back at all you've written, I've always just wanted to ask you how you saw yourself. And I know that you're a very humble person who probably doesn't think in these terms very often, but if you could look back at the history of religious literature, the history of thought, the history of civilization, who would you compare yourself to? And not to say that you are the same as this person, but just that the project that you view your life's work as undertaking, who had a similar project in history as the project you see yourself attacking in your life's work?
It's hard to say, because I never intended to do this. You see, I wasn't, as you know, I was a nun for some years, and I left the order, and I thought I'd never wanted anything to do with religion ever again. And came back to it, and I wanted to be an English literature professor. But everything I did failed. I got a very good first-class degree in Oxford, but then I failed my PhD with horrible publicity. It was not properly examined, and they said, you know, but I could not have it re-examined because that would vitiate the sanctity of the Oxford doctorate. So that was the end of my career, and I became a school teacher, and I had to leave because of ill health. Everything I did failed until I fell by accident into religion. And at first, my first books were very angry about religion. And, you know, very sort of smart and clever. But that changed because I had a wonderful literary agent who has died recently. But and she never sat me down and said, now look about these books of yours, which are pretty superficial stuff. But her own sense of what Matthew Arnold called high seriousness got to me somehow. And I thought, what I'm doing is not good enough. We've got, life is serious. And my whole view of God and everything started to change. I think we need to realize how serious our lives are. That we can all make such a difference to the people around us. And we can do it in a very negative way too. We can leave people feeling, as I often have done, I'm afraid, feeling stupid, or because you make a clever remark, or you do better than them, or you look down on other people. No, we need to realize how serious our lives are, and that we must leave it to do with some good. And I think, I don't know how I got on to this, but I think if we can all say on our deathbed, well, I've tried to do some good. Maybe it's changed a little bit, even if, however small it is, that you could leave something behind. So much of religion is spent about believing things. And I don't think that's important at all. I don't know what I believe. But if you start living in a way that to see that the smallest thing you do can have an effect on people. You can make an unkind word that can last with somebody for a lifetime, that they never forget it. And I'm sure I've done that many times. But that we have a job to leave the world a little bit better because we've been in it. And that means being alive to the issues of the day and not thinking, well, this is just too big for us to handle. What can I particularly do in my particular little venue to make it a better place? I think that's it for me.
Wow. Thank you for that answer. That was beautiful. Karen, we're almost out of time here. I have a couple questions that are from the audience. Do you think if we could maybe do them quickly and then, okay.
Yeah.
So as much, because I know that you could speak probably on both of these for so long, and some of these are getting at some of the things we've already talked about, but just two quick questions. So thank you for this book. I often feel completely defeated about the environment. I feel powerless and therefore I feel helpless. How do you personally deal with this kind of feeling?
Yes, because I know exactly what you feel, and you feel helpless and it's all too big. What we can is just to take, you can just to change your behavior a little bit day by day. And these are the things that I, are not life-changing things that you're going to be sort of nature addicts, and become wordsworthy in yourself. Just a little bit a day. Little things that we can do that just rescue us from our solipsism, our preoccupation with ourselves, we're so stupid, and so we're all so stupid and thinks so much of ourselves, and we need to just smile at ourselves a bit occasionally, but just little things day by day.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one more question. This question is phrased a bit bluntly, but I do appreciate this question. You say mythos is quote unquote real, but it is not quote unquote real from the perspective of science. How can this argument even be made?
Oh, well, you see, we need science desperately, and as I say, I've been a great beneficiary of it. But we have other needs too. We read poetry. We fall in love in an irrational way. We have all kinds of fears and all kinds of insights too that are not necessarily scientific. So we need to cultivate, I think, the sense compassion is the key. The ability to feel with others, pathein in Greek, just to take ourselves out day by day, little by little, and putting yourself in other people's shoes and seeing the stupidity of one's own ego. And how absurd we are with the way we strut around, and our problems are so huge, they are tiny in relation to the world. I don't know whether that's the only advice I can give. It's not about believing things or accepting a lot of theological ideas or changing your life so you'll be a saint from this day forward, because you're not, you won't. But just a little, if you could, just when you go to bed at night, you can say, perhaps I did one good thing today. That's all. And think small, not huge.
Thank you, Karen. All right. So we're going to wrap with one last question from me. This is a question that I always ask every writer that comes on the show. And it's this: if you could imagine the ideal reader for this book, and I guess people have different definitions of what an ideal reader is, but maybe it's the person who will most understand it, but it also could be the person who most needs to hear it. However you want to define the ideal reader for this book, just imagine that person has just finished reading it. And could you describe in a phrase or even just a single word, what is the feeling that this reader has finishing your book?
I would like to think that the reader has begun to see the marvel of nature, the holiness of it, that by little, day by day, we, instead of just taking it for granted or as just the scenic backdrop of our lives, to see our sense of utter dependence upon it and the wonder of it, to be like the ancient Egyptians and wonder at the fact that the solar system enables the sun to rise every morning, and that the seas do not overstep the mark, that the moon draws back the sea every night, to make ourselves wonder instead of just taking it for granted.
Wonderful, Karen. Thank you so much. And I will say, while you were giving that beautiful answer, there was a fly that came and landed on my computer, and I was tempted to smack it. But given that we are having this conversation, I thought, what an inappropriate thing to do. So I just gently brushed it away. So it's the small things, Karen.
That is wonderful. And you'll find a wonderful bit from the poem in the book, from the novelist Tristram Shandy, 18th century, where Uncle Toby, one of the character in a book, 18th century book, sees a fly and says, "I will not do that to you." It takes it outside and lets it go, talking to it gently all the time. That's lovely. Just sparing a fly day by day, it changes your mindset.
Yeah.
It changes your mindset by little. That's exactly the kind of way to change. We're not going to become great environmentalists all overnight, but just recognizing that fly is a creature of its own, that has its own wonder and its own extraordinary problems, and a mystery, really, the little fly. Then we're on the right path.
Wonderful. All right. Well, Karen, this has been such a treat for me. The book is so beautiful. And like all your works, it really moved me. And I'm so grateful you came on the show today. As I said, I've been a lifelong fan, and this is just sort of rambling now because I just almost don't want the interview to end. I'm just so grateful you came on the show. So thank you.
It's been wonderful. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it very much. It's been good to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And everybody who joined, thank you for joining, and we'll see you next week on the